welcome back to Idiot Mystic. Okay, I never say that. I was trying something different. I don't like it, but I'm gonna leave it in here, so you know what I go through. This is part 2 of the Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon series. In part 1, we started with the big picture, Laurel Canyon, the official hippie dream, the weird number of military family backgrounds around the scene, and then Lookout Mountain, which is probably one of the strangest details in the whole story. A secret military film studio sitting right above the place that later becomes mythologized as this spontaneous little garden of music, freedom, and beautiful people making art in the hills. That already changes the way the canyon feels, but part 2 is where we stop looking at the hills from far away and start going inside the rooms. Because before the counterculture became a national image, before Monterey pop, before the summer of love became something people could buy on a poster, it had to become a social world. And what I mean by that is it had to have houses, clubs, hosts, gatekeepers, older weirdos, people trying to be artists, and people who were just close enough to power to make the whole thing feel magical. This is where McGowan gets into Vito Paulekas and the Freaks, the strange dancers and scene makers who helped make the music feel like a movement before it actually fully existed. And these weren't just random people in the crowd. These were the people helping creating the atmosphere and teaching everyone in the room how to behave. And this is something very important to note, because a scene is never only the band on stage. A scene is usually the bodies around the band, the people who make everyone else feel like something important is actually happening. And this applies to modern music scenes and subcultures as well. Then it gets darker. We get into Vito Paulekas, Vito's young son, whose death is one of the most disturbing early shadows in the book. We'll get into Kenneth anger, Lucifer rising, Bobby Beausoleil, and the way occult film, rock music, young people, performance, and danger all start overlapping in the same rooms in LA at the exact same time. So this episode isn't really about whether every single claim proves one giant conspiracy. That's probably not the most interesting way to hear this. The real questions are simpler and creepier. What kind of rooms were these? Who had power in them? Who was being watched? Who was being used? And why did the official story of peace, love, and music leave so much of this out? Because in part 1, the canyon started looking less innocent just from a distance. In part 2, since we're going inside, I think you can imagine how crazy it's about to get. Before Laurel Canyon became the holy little birthplace of the LA counterculture, it was already strange. The popular story often begins in the mid-1960s, as though the canyon waited quietly until the right young musicians arrived. McGowan pushes back on that. The canyon already had an older history of leisure, wealth, resorts, hillside properties, and a relationship to secrecy that made it feel less like a normal neighborhood, and maybe a little more like something contained, something with private entrances. I think the log cabin is so important because even though it was a house, it was also a place that changed people. Anyone who has been around artists, musicians, spiritual seekers, addicts, performers, or just intense people with no stable sleep schedule knows that a scene does not really tell you what the rules are. You have to absorb the rules. You'll walk into a room and learn what kind of person gets attention there by being there. You learn what's admired, mocked, and rewarded. You also learn what's confused with depth. The log cabin in McGowan's telling becomes one of the places where the normal rules of middle-class life were suspended. Musicians came through, hangers-on came through, weirdos, young women, so many people. And Zappa occupied the role of host, patriarch, and ringmaster of the freak world. And of course, if you're younger, you've never heard of these people, I understand. You'll have to do a little research. You can start on Spotify if you want. And I've mentioned this before, but a music scene isn't just the sound. Before a song becomes a record, it belongs to a social world. It comes from rooms where people meet, compete, flirt, and learn what kind of performance gets them closer to that center. The official history remembers songs and bands because songs and bands are easy to package. The private life of a scene is harder to package because it usually involves power. This is where Vito Paulekas enters. Vito was older than the young musicians and dancers around him, a beatnik-era figure who, along with Carl Franzoni and others, helped shape a pre-hippie social world around dance, performance, and this theatrical kind of wildness. McGowan treats Vito and the Freaks as crucial to the early success of several Laurel Canyon-linked bands because they gave the music a body. They danced, they drew attention, they made the clubs feel alive. They gave early bands an atmosphere to play into. A band on stage with a stiff audience is just a band trying very hard. A band on stage with wild, strange, beautiful dancers moving like the future has already arrived starts to look like a movement. This is one of McGowan's darker insights, I think. Culture can be staged socially before it is packaged commercially. You don't need a corporation to invent every detail. Sometimes a small group creates a look, a behavior, or an energy, and then the industry recognizes it as sellable. At first, the Freaks seemed like colorful side characters, but they were the ones who made hippie culture visible. But Vito's world also brings in the ugly side of freedom. McGowan presents a world of crash pads, very young women, sexual availability, older male gatekeepers, and adults using the language of liberation to avoid saying what was actually happening. This is one of the ugliest and most disgusting parts of the 1960s mythology. A lot of behavior that later generations would immediately recognize as exploitative was protected by phrases like free love, experimentation, and different times. And as anyone who's been in one would know, rooms without rules don't stay innocent for too long. When old rules disappear, new rules arrive. They might look like charisma, coolness, drug tolerance, sexual openness, artistic seriousness, or even loyalty to the group, but they are just rules. The person most likely to suffer is usually the youngest, loneliest, most impressionable person in the room. From my experience, a real spiritual community protects the vulnerable. A fake one consumes them and calls the consumption freedom. This is where Laurel Canyon becomes much more than music history. I think it becomes a warning to anyone listening about boundarylessness. The old world was often repressive, yes, but the collapse of repression did not automatically create wisdom. It created rooms where predators could learn the language of the youth. The story of Vito Paulekas changes the emotional temperature of McGowan's book. Until this point, it was all just standing at a distance, talking about scenes, symbols, and mythology. Then a child dies, and the distance becomes much harder to keep. Vito was the young son of Vito Paulekas and Sue. In the public image of the freak scene, he seems to have functioned almost like a mascot of innocence. A small child moving through this world of dancers, artists, and adults who had decided that the old rules no longer applied. McGowan lingers on Vito because the child's death rips apart this golden mythology to shreds. The accounts of what happened are inconsistent. Some describe a fall through a trap door on a roof. others a scaffold, a skylight, or an accident connected to a photo session. Medical malpractice versions also circulate. The confusion itself becomes part of the unease. When a child dies inside a social world already filled with unstable boundaries, I don't think the ambiguity is neutral. It feels contaminated. A dead child should not become a prop for a theory, so the story has to be handled carefully. The fact alone is terrible enough. A little boy died inside this world. That should be enough to interpret the dream, but what makes the story more disturbing is the reported reaction around it. McGowan cites accounts suggesting Vito and Sue continued with their night, even going out dancing after the death. Grief can make people behave strangely, and there is no single normal way to respond to catastrophe. Still, I think that's a bad look. This is one of the frightening things about intense social worlds and scenes. Once a group has enough momentum, even tragedy can become an atmosphere instead of a reason to change. People absorb the horror and just keep dancing, or smoking, or drinking. The group survives by refusing to fully process what happened. Kenneth Anger enters the story here. Anger is one of those figures who feels designed for an Idiot Mystic episode. Experimental filmmaker, Hollywood mythologist, occult enthusiast, author of Hollywood Babylon, and a man who understood that cinema, scandal, ritual, celebrity, sexuality, and death were not separate subjects. If you ever watch any of his stuff, there's just something weird, something off, something almost spell-like. I'll just say that. McGowan connects Anger to Godot through Lucifer Rising, the long gestating film project that would later become one of Anger's major occult works. In the version McGowan discusses, Godot had been considered or selected as an early Lucifer figure before his death. Later, the Lucifer role became associated with Bobby Beausoleil, who would become infamous through his connection to Charles Manson and the murder of Gary Hinman. That sequence is almost too much. A child connected to the freak scene, a Lucifer role, a strange death, an occult filmmaker, then Beausoleil stepping into the symbolic space before drifting right into the Manson family. None of this proves a hidden ritual. A filmmaker using occult imagery does not automatically turn surrounding tragedies into rituals themselves. But the symbolic chain here is heavy enough that even a skeptical listener should pause. Lucifer in Anger's symbolic universe is not like the Sunday school devil. In many occult and esoteric traditions, Lucifer is reframed as lightbringer, rebel, beautiful intelligence, illumination through transgression. You can see why that symbol would appeal to the counterculture. The young person rejecting the father, the artist rejecting society, the generation wanting light without inheriting morality. The danger here is that not all light heals. Some of it burns, some of it dazzles, some of it makes you feel chosen, while slowly making you less human. A culture obsessed with rebellion eventually has to ask what kind of light it's looking for. Once innocence becomes material for someone else's artistic or spiritual project, I think we can say something has definitely gone wrong. One of the most revealing tests of any spiritual or artistic community is what happens to the children around it. A community can say all the right things about love, beauty, liberation, and truth, but if the kids near it are not safe, then something at the center is rotten. So that's where I want to leave part 2, because by this point, to me at least, Laurel Canyon doesn't feel like a music scene. It feels like this set of rooms that people is just going between, and things are happening to them, and they are changing in ways that They never thought they could. The official version usually gives us finished mythology. The bands, the songs, the beautiful houses in the hills. The idea that all of this just naturally bloomed out of some collective hunger for freedom. But when we look at Vito and the Freaks, Godo, Kenneth Anger, Lucifer Rising, Bobby Beausoleil, and the strange social world around these people, I think the dream starts feeling a lot less clean. The counterculture kept talking about freedom, but freedom inside an unsafe room can become something else really fast. It becomes access and exposure. It can become older people with power surrounding younger people who think they're finally being seen. It can become a place where everyone says there are no rules. Certain people still control the room. This is the part that seems really important to me, not just as creepy old history, but as a warning. Any scene can call itself liberating. Any room can call itself spiritual, artistic, healing, underground, whatever. But the real test is what happens to the vulnerable people inside it. Are they being protected? Are they being listened to? Can they say no? Are they still treated like full human beings once the music stops? In the next episode, we move from these early dark rooms into the nightmare everyone knows by name, Charles Manson. But the point McGowan keeps making is that Manson did not just fall out of the sky. He wanted a record deal. He got close to Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys. He got close to Terry Melcher. He got close to the exact same music world that was selling the dream to everyone else. So next time, we'll talk about Manson, Hollywood, Dennis Wilson, Terry Melcher, Cielo Drive, and the terrible possibility that the nightmare itself was not outside the hippie dream. It had already been invited in. Thank you for listening to Idiomistic. If you are following this series, make sure you subscribe, because I'm going through the whole thing pretty carefully, piece by piece. I think it's going to be 7 parts, and I'm trying not to pretend like every connection is proof, but also not pretending that the official story is enough. Anyway, I'll see you in part 3.